John and Joyce are just like any other siblings, curious, playful, and eager to learn about the world around them. But sometimes, the lessons they pick up are not the ones we hope they will. This story is a reminder of how little eyes and ears are always watching, always listening, and how even the smallest moments can have the biggest consequences. This is the story of John and Joyce. John is 10 years old, a spirited and energetic boy who loves football and is always the leader of the all-playful moments. Joyce, at 8, is sweet and thoughtful, looking up to her big brother for guidance in almost everything. The Johnsons' family lived in a modest but cozy home. The kind of home filled with laughter and occasional chaos, where mornings were a rush of school uniforms and packed lunches, and evenings were spent with stories at the dinner table. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were the kind of parents who loved deeply but, like many others, found themselves caught in the hustle of daily life. Work demanded long hours, leaving the children often under John's care during the evenings. On this particular evening, Mrs. Johnson stood in the living room, with purse in her hand, and gave her usual instructions. "John, take care of your sister while we're out. No TV until your homework is done." Her voice carried the firmness of a mother who meant every word, but it was laced with trust. She trusted her children. And why wouldn't she? They were good kids. John, always the cheeky one, grinned and replied, "Yes, Mommy." His charm could melt any mother's heart, and Mrs. Johnson, though hurried, smiled back. She glanced at Joyce, who was quietly tying her shoelaces, and added, "And Joyce, listen to your brother. I don't want any complaints when we get back." Joyce nodded, her little voice soft but clear, "Yes, Mommy." As the car pulled out of the driveway, the house fell silent. For a moment, the stillness was comforting. But in that stillness lay the first step towards something the Johnsons would never forget. John and Joyce sat at the dining table, their books spread out before them. Homework was a ritual, one they didn't particularly enjoy but knew better than to skip. John scribbled answers with the speed of someone eager to be done, while Joyce struggled with her math problems. "John, what's 3 times 8? She asked, her small face scrunched in concentration. John, barely looking up, replied, 24. "Hurry up, or we'll never finish." They walked quietly for another 15 minutes until John declared, "I'm done." He pushed his books aside and leaned back in his chair. Joyce, still halfway through her assignment, frowned. "But I'm not done yet." John shrugged. "Well, you can catch up later. Let's do something fun." Fun, in John's world, usually meant sneaking a few minutes of TV time before their parents returned. He walked to the living room, turned on the television, and began flipping through channels. Joyce protested from the dining table. "John, Mommy said no TV." But John, as always, had a quick reply. "We'll only watch for a little while. She won't even know." Channel after channel, they skipped past cartoons and news programs, searching for something interesting. And then, they stumbled upon it. A late-night movie, one that shouldn't have been on at that hour but somehow was. The scene on the screen was nothing like the cheerful cartoons they were used to. It was confusing, intense, and unfamiliar. Joyce sat on the couch, her eyes wide. "John, what are they doing?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and unease. John, equally puzzled but trying to appear confident, replied, "I don't know, but it looks fun." They sat there, transfixed, unable to look away. They didn't fully understand what they were seeing, but something about it drew them in. It was new. Different. A world they'd never been exposed to before. And so, the seeds of curiosity were planted in their young, impressionable minds. What they didn't understand, they wanted to figure out. What seemed strange and new became something they couldn't stop thinking about. The movie ended, but the images lingered. Questions they couldn't ask swirled in their minds, and answers they couldn't find began to shape their thoughts. That night, as they lay in bed, John whispered to Joyce, "Do you think Mommy and Daddy ever watched something like that?" Joyce, turning to face him in the darkness, replied, "I don't know. Maybe we can ask them." John quickly shook his head. "No way. They'll be mad we watch TV. Let's keep it a secret." And just like that, the first layer of trust between them and their parents began to peel away. The next morning, as their parents sat with them at breakfast, everything seemed normal. Mrs. Johnson packed their lunchboxes while Mr. Johnson read the newspaper. John and Joyce ate their cereal quietly, sneaking glances at each other but saying nothing about what they'd seen. Secrets, as small as they may seem at first, have a way of growing. And in the Johnson home, a small secret was about to turn into something much bigger. Days passed, and the children's routine seemed to return to normal, but something had shifted beneath the surface. John, once eager to help Joyce with her schoolwork, was now a little more distant. He spent more time on his own, and when Joyce would call to him, there was a new sense of urgency in his voice. One evening, after dinner, John whispered to his sister, "Let's do it again, Joyce. Let's try what we saw on TV." Joyce, who had been uncomfortable with the idea before, felt torn. She didn't really understand what she had seen, but John's excitement was hard to resist. "But, what if Mommy finds out?" she asked, her voice soft, unsure. John shook his head with a grin. "Mommy won't know. It's just a game. We are only pretending. It will be fun." Joyce didn't fully understand what was happening, but she trusted her brother. And so, they began to mimic what they had seen on the television. The behaviors, awkward and out of place for children of their age, felt strange, but they went along with it, believing it was nothing more than a game. After all, they had no idea of the deeper meaning behind the actions they were imitating. John convinced Joyce that no one would know, that it was just a secret between the two of them. They laughed nervously as they practiced the strange scenes in their room, trying to reenact the gestures and words they had seen on TV. Their world had become a little darker, a little more confusing. And while the game they played felt innocent in their eyes, it was, in reality, the beginning of something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, in the house, things started to change. Mrs. Johnson noticed that Joyce, who was usually chatty and full of energy, had become quieter and more withdrawn. She would sit for hours, staring out the window or fidgeting with her fingers, lost in her thoughts. It was as if her joyful spirit had been dimmed. Mrs. Johnson, concerned, asked, "Joyce, why are you so quiet lately? Is something wrong?" Joyce looked up from her hands, blinking as if she had been pulled from a distant place. "Nothing, Mommy. I'm fine," she replied, her voice lacking the usual warmth and cheer. Mrs. Johnson felt a pang of unease but didn't push further, trusting that her daughter would open up when she was ready. John, on the other hand, was becoming more defensive. When his mother asked about his day at school, he would shrug and answer with a short "fine," before changing the subject. His usual enthusiasm for sharing stories from school seemed to have vanished. Mrs. Johnson noticed how his gaze shifted nervously when she asked about Joyce, as if he were hiding something. But she couldn't quite place what it was. As the days went by, the tension in the house grew, though no one could fully grasp what was happening. Then, one Saturday afternoon, Auntie Deborah, Mr. Johnson's sister, came to visit. She had always been close to the children, and they loved spending time with her. But on this particular visit, she noticed something wasn't right. She arrived just in time to see John and Joyce playing in the living room. They were laughing, but there was something off about the way they interacted. John was holding a toy car, but his tone when he spoke to Joyce was different, too commanding, too serious for a child. Joyce, unusually quiet, followed her brother's lead without question. Then, Auntie Deborah heard it. John, in a tone that sounded almost rehearsed, said to his sister, "Don't you enjoy the push in and push out from behind?" Joyce looked up at him, her face confused, but she didn't respond. Auntie Deborah's eyes widened as she realized that something was terribly wrong. The playful, innocent games she remembered from her own childhood were being replaced by something far more troubling. Auntie Deborah's heart sank. She knew she had to act quickly. She waited for a quiet moment, then approached the children, her voice gentle but firm. "John, Joyce," she began, "I've noticed some things that don't seem right. What have you been up to?" John, always quick with his words, avoided her gaze and muttered, "Nothing, Auntie. We were just playing." But Auntie Deborah was determined. She wasn't going to let this go. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "What kind of playing? What have you been doing when no one is around?" John's eyes darted nervously around the room. He didn't know how to lie to his aunt, someone who always seemed to know when something was wrong. Joyce, who had been silent until then, spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. We were doing what we saw on TV." The words stumbled out, and as soon as they were said, Auntie Deborah felt her heart drop. The truth was out. "What? What did you see on TV?" Auntie Deborah asked, her voice trembling now. "We saw a movie," John explained reluctantly. "It was late, and we watched it. It looked fun, so we tried it, like a game." Auntie Deborah's mind raced, but she kept her calm. She knew she had to handle this carefully. She sat down with the children, one at a time, and gently asked them what exactly they had been imitating. They didn't fully understand the impact of their actions, but as they explained, it became clear that they were mimicking adult behaviors of having sex with each other. "You need to understand, John, Joyce," Auntie Deborah said, her voice a mixture of concern and urgency, "what you saw on that TV wasn't a game. It was something for adults, not children. What you're doing is dangerous, and you can't keep it a secret anymore." Auntie Deborah wasted no time. She called Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Her voice was steady, but there was a sense of urgency behind it. "You need to hear this," she said. "I've been watching the children, and something is wrong. They're imitating something they saw on TV, adults having sex with each other." Mr. Johnson, who had been listening intently, reacted immediately. "What? How could this happen under our roof? We've been careful." His voice was filled with shock and disbelief. "They're just children. How could they even understand something like that?" Auntie Deborah explained everything she had witnessed, the odd behaviors, the awkward interactions, and how they had confessed to mimicking what they saw. "You need to address this immediately," she urged. "They don't understand what they are doing, but they are playing with something they can't handle." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson sat in stunned silence, grappling with the weight of what they had just heard. How did this happen? How did they miss the signs? The guilt began to wash over them, but they knew one thing for sure: this was not something they could ignore any longer. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as the Johnson family sat down together in the living room. John and Joyce sat, their heads lowered in shame, as their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, took a deep breath. The room was silent for a few moments, the gravity of the situation clear in everyone's hearts. Mr. Johnson finally spoke, his voice stern but filled with concern. "John, Joyce, you've seen things you were never meant to see. Things that are too complicated, too grown up for children like you. But we failed you. We didn't protect you from what you shouldn't have known, and for that, we are truly sorry. Mrs. Johnson, who had been silently holding back tears, now spoke softly, her voice shaking with emotion. We failed to protect you from things you're too young to understand. But this ends now. We'll make sure nothing like this happens again. Do you understand? John, his face flushed with embarrassment, nodded. Yes, Mommy, we understand. We are sorry, he whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. Joyce, sitting beside her brother, looked up at their mother, her eyes wide and teary. We didn't know, she said, her voice full of confusion and regret. We didn't understand what we were doing. Mr. Johnson placed a hand on John's shoulder, his tone softening. It's okay. What matters now is that we can fix this, together. He turned to Joyce. We are here for you, always. Mrs. Johnson wiped her eyes, trying to hold herself together, but it was clear how deeply this had affected her. We will make changes, real changes. You won't be left alone with a screen anymore. No more late-night TV, and we'll start monitoring everything you watch. We'll be more involved in your lives, every step of the way. John, still feeling the weight of his actions, spoke up again. We promise, Mommy. We won't do it again. His voice was filled with sincerity, a promise he would strive to keep. And so, the Johnson family made a commitment to protect their children from the dangers that lurked in the shadows of unchecked screen time. They realized that their children's innocence had been put at risk, not because of malice, but from a simple failure to understand just how dangerous the digital world could be for young minds. The changes in the house came quickly. The TV was no longer a source of endless entertainment. The parents set strict boundaries, ensuring that the children's TV time was regulated, with parental controls placed on every device they owned. John and Joyce no longer had the option to browse freely, late into the night, watching whatever caught their attention. They could now only watch age-appropriate content, with their parents present and involved in the decision-making process. Instead of long hours spent in front of the screen, the children were now encouraged to engage in other activities. Mrs. Johnson introduced storytelling sessions each evening, a tradition that had been forgotten in the busyness of their daily lives. The family would sit together on the mat, listening to tales of their ancestors, stories that carried lessons of wisdom, morality, and strength. These were the stories that shaped the foundation of their culture, and now, they were beginning to shape the lives of John and Joyce once more. John and Joyce also began to read books more regularly, encouraged by their parents to develop a love for learning beyond the confines of technology. At first, they resisted. It was hard to pull them away from the familiar glow of the television screen. But as the days passed, they discovered the joy of reading. Joyce became fascinated by the adventures of heroes and heroines in the books she read, and John began to immerse himself in tales of brave warriors and wise leaders. It wasn't easy. There were moments when John and Joyce, still curious and growing, would slip back into old habits. But their parents were vigilant, watching over them with love and care. They created a routine that felt safer, more nurturing, a routine filled with guidance, support, and shared experiences. As they began to grow, the children started to heal, their innocence slowly returning, piece by piece. They laughed again, but this time, their laughter was freer, more genuine. They no longer carried the burden of confusion or guilt. Their minds, once clouded by things they didn't understand, were now being filled with knowledge, values, and real-life lessons that could guide them for years to come. One evening, as the family sat around the table for dinner, something beautiful happened. John, who had been quiet for most of the evening, spoke up, his voice steady. "Mommy, Daddy," he began, "thank you for helping us. I think we are doing better now." Mrs. Johnson smiled at her son, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm glad to hear that, John. You and Joyce are a responsibility, and we'll always protect you, no matter what. This is a new beginning, a fresh start for our family." Joyce, looking up at her parents with a smile that had not graced her face in weeks, added, "I'm happy now, Mommy. Thank you for helping me." The healing process wasn't instantaneous. It took time, patience, and effort. But through it all, the Johnson family emerged stronger, more united than ever. They learned a valuable lesson, that parenting is not just about providing for your children, but also about protecting them from the dangers that can so easily slip through the cracks. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that communication is key. With open hearts and open minds, they promised each other that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always be there for one another. Life after the healing had begun in the Johnson home wasn't without its challenges, but there was a sense of peace that had replaced the tension. Slowly but surely, John and Joyce were learning to navigate a world that, at times, seemed overwhelming, one where the boundaries of right and wrong weren't always clear. As the weeks passed, the changes in the family became evident. There were no more long hours spent mindlessly watching television. Instead, their evenings were filled with conversation, games, and learning. Mr. Johnson would often come home from work and share stories of his day, lessons from the office that John would excitedly dissect. Joyce, always eager to listen, would ask endless questions about the world around her. Gone were the days of sneaky glances at the television, of uncertain steps toward behaviors they couldn't understand. Now, John and Joyce were focused on things that truly mattered. They were no longer experimenting with things they had no business knowing about. Instead, they were growing stronger, wiser, and more grounded in the values their parents had always tried to instill in them. John, no longer the rebellious older brother, had become an active helper around the house. Every Saturday morning, he would rise early and help his father with the household chores. He'd wash the car, sweep the compound, and even help his mother with the laundry. It wasn't just about the chores, it was about responsibility, about growing into someone who could be relied upon. Joyce, too, had transformed. The once withdrawn, quiet girl was now the bubbly light of the home. She had discovered a love for drawing, and her walls were now adorned with vibrant, colorful pictures of her dreams. She would often sit at the dining table with her crayons and papers, sharing her latest work with her family, who would shower her with praise. The joy in her eyes as she spoke about her pictures was a reflection of the peace that had settled in her heart. The healing wasn't just internal. The family had developed a deeper connection, one that transcended the material things they'd once focused on. Every morning, before going to work, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson would gather their children for a brief family devotion. It was a time to reflect, to pray, and to strengthen their bond as a family. These simple moments became the foundation upon which they built their days. At times, John and Joyce would question the world around them, especially when they encountered peers who were still indulging in behaviors they once knew too well. They would ask their parents, "Why can't we do this?" or "Why do our friends act like that?" Mr. Johnson would take these opportunities to gently guide them, explaining the importance of making good choices and understanding the consequences of their actions. "The world can be confusing, my children," he would say, "but if you stand firm in what's right, you always know which path to take." The ripple effects of their healing were not limited to the immediate family. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson made it their mission to educate their friends and extended family on the dangers of unmonitored media consumption. They began hosting gatherings where they would talk openly about the importance of setting boundaries and protecting children from harmful content. Their story, the story of their own mistakes and triumphs became a powerful example for others. Auntie Deborah, who had been the first to notice something was wrong, continued to play a vital role in the family's recovery. She would visit often, checking in on the children and offering support. One day, she shared with Mrs. Johnson, "I'm proud of how far you've come. It's not easy, but you've done it with so much grace. Your children are blessed to have you." Mrs. Johnson, ever humble, smiled and responded, "We all need each other. Together, we can keep our children safe." John and Joyce, now fully aware of the boundaries their parents had set for them, took pride in their growing maturity. John was especially excited about the upcoming school play, where he had been chosen to play the lead role of a brave prince. He worked hard to memorize his lines and rehearsed every day, often asking his sister for her opinion on how he could improve his performance. Joyce, ever the supportive little sister, was his biggest fan. She would sit beside him as he practiced, offering words of encouragement. "You'll be great, John. You've got this." And John, with a smile, would nod, knowing that her belief in him made him stronger. Despite the many changes, the family knew they couldn't stop their vigilance. The world was still full of distractions, and the dangers they'd once faced were never far behind. But this time, they were ready. They were stronger, more informed, and united in their purpose. Parenting is not a journey that comes with a manual. It's a continuous process of learning, growing, and sometimes, correcting course. But in the end, it's a path that leads to stronger, healthier families, families who are equipped to face the challenges of the world, together. Let this story be a call to all parents, no matter how hard the road may seem, never stop guiding, never stop protecting. Our children depend on us, not just to provide, but to teach them right from wrong, to give them the tools they need to navigate the world with wisdom and integrity. The future is in their hands, but it starts with us. Together, let's make sure they grow up strong, secure, and safe. Remember, the greatest legacy we can leave our children is not just material wealth, but wisdom, love, and the courage to make the right choices. Let this story be a wake-up call. It's time to take control of what your children are exposed to. It's time to set boundaries, to have those difficult but necessary conversations, and to ensure that your home remains a place of safety, love, and growth. The foundation you lay today will shape the future of your children, and every choice you make, no matter how small, has the power to make a difference. If this story touched you, if it made you stop and think about how you're parenting or what your children are encountering, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it with others, family, friends, fellow parents, anyone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can create a safer world for our children, a world where they are protected from the dangers that lurk behind the screens, where they can grow up in an environment filled with love, wisdom, and the guidance they need to make the right choices. Remember, parenting isn't about perfection, it's about being present, being involved, and most importantly, being aware. So, take the first step today. Start the conversation. Set the boundaries. And ensure that your children are growing up in a home where they are loved, guided, and protected from harm. Don't wait until it's too late. Take action now. Protect your children. Share this video with others. And let's create a safer, brighter future for the next generation. Because every child deserves to grow up in a world where they can thrive, where they are shielded from harm, and where their parents are always there to guide them every step of the way. Thank you for watching, and remember, your actions today shape the future of tomorrow.